At this time, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers here this evening. My good friend who came in through the clutch here is Dr. Todd Allen. He is the Special Assistant to the President and Provost for Diversity Affairs, as well as Professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Messiah College. In 2002, Dr. Allen founded the Common Ground Project, a community-based nonprofit dedicated to promoting an understanding of the civil rights movement. For the past 19 years, in partnership with the PNC Foundation, he has led one of the longest operating civil rights movement tours in the nation. It's called Returning to the Roots of Civil Rights. And if at the end we have enough time, we'll ask Todd a little bit about that. But it was featured in a 2006 documentary produced by WQED Pittsburgh. For his scholarship, he has been the recipient of numerous awards, including fellowships at the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, NEH Fellowship, the New Pittsburgh Courier 50 Men of Excellence, and the WYCA of Greater Pittsburgh Racial Justice Award. Our featured author this evening is Peniel E. Joseph. He is the Barbara Jordan Chair in Ethics and Political Values at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and Professor of History at the University of Texas at Austin. He is the founding director of the LBJ School Center for the Study of Race and Democracy. His career focus has been on Black Power studies, which encompasses interdisciplinary fields such as Africana studies, law and society, women's and ethnic studies, and political science. He has written several books on African American history, including Stokely, A Life. He lives in Austin, Texas. Of course, the book we are here for this evening is titled The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. Most of you in our audience are familiar with Ibram Kendi. Ibram has visited Harrisburg twice for his books, and Ibram offers praise of this book that I absolutely have to read in full. He says, in quote, "The Sword and the Shield is a landmark. It is what happens when one of America's greatest historians of African America shines a light on two of African America's greatest historical figures. Peniel Joseph deploys his supreme talents as a biographer and movement historian to interweave the world-shattering lives of Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X." I think that's a great place to hand it off. So without further ado, a virtual welcome to Todd Allen and Peniel Joseph.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex. Peniel, it's indeed an honor to be with you this evening for a conversation about The Sword and the Shield, a book that's been out for a little over a week now, or about a week now. And as we've heard, it's received some glowing endorsements. Just before I ask you about why this book is so needed at this moment, might be helpful for you to provide us a little bit of context. And so, as we heard in your intro, as a scholar, you've established yourself as one of the leading voices, if not the leading voice, in the field of Black Power movement studies. What's the relationship between what some refer to as the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement? Or is there a more helpful way to frame this period of history?
Yeah, Todd, thank you for hosting us and for being the interlocutor here. I think that civil rights and Black Power are part of the Black liberation movement, Black freedom struggles. And I think of civil rights and Black Power as being different branches in the same family tree. And sometimes those branches intertwine and intersect. Sometimes those branches go and they diverge. But when we think about civil rights and Black Power, these are social movements that existed both in tandem and parallel with each other, but at times intersected. There were some African-American activists, women and men, who defined themselves as being a part of each distinct movement, but there were others who straddled both. So that's the best way for us to think about civil rights and Black Power. And there's no better example than the fact that Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. sort of exist side by side for much of their public careers. And both of them are really icons of both the civil rights and Black Power eras.
With this text, you join a fraternity of scholars who've taken on these two gentlemen, Louis Lomax, James Baldwin, James Cohn, Michael Dyson, to name a few. A single biography would be challenging enough. Why a dual biography, and why now? What inspired you to write this book?
Well, I think this book really grows out of all the work that I've been doing on the civil rights, Black Power era, my interest in race and democracy, social justice movements. I'm the proud son of Haitian immigrants who came to the United States in 1965. I was born and raised in New York City. I was weaned on tales of both the Haitian Revolution, but also Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., especially their support of labor unions. My mom was part of SCIU 1199, which was Dr. King's union and Malcolm's union. This is hospital workers union. She worked at Mount Sinai for over 40 years. I was on my first picket line in elementary school. So I got a real education in New York City about racial politics, labor, trade unionism. I look at and perceive Malcolm X as the most important Black working class political activist of the 20th century. I think of Martin Luther King Jr. as the most important anti-poverty activist of the 20th century. They both fused that with racial justice, with anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism, a critique of capitalism. And the reason why I think we need it now more than ever, Todd, is multiple reasons. On one level, the beloved community that Dr. King was looking for, the struggle for radical Black dignity that Malcolm X was advocating for, was really these aspirational visions in a world that was very, very horrifically unequal, right? That was filled with all kinds of institutional and structural oppression. And I think in the context of the Corona crisis, what we've seen, especially for those of us who aren't in the weeds, because I think some of the folks in the audience might say, well, we've realized this, but what we have to do is be humble. There's a meme going around that says, if you're worried about paying the rent, if you're worried about when your next paycheck is coming, if you're worried about all these different things since Corona, they say, don't worry, now you know what it's like to be Black for just 3 weeks. We've been living with this our whole life, right? So there's that, right? But many people don't. I think what Corona has proven globally is this idea, scholars call it precarity, but we're really talking about poverty and vulnerability, right? That the most vulnerable people are the ones who are going to suffer the most, right? And really the people who trafficked the virus the most were the people who had the most access, which is why sometimes people were looking, initially it was just celebrities and people who were, whether it's Tom Hanks or whoever in Australia. And because it's so highly infectious, my brother's an ER doctor, and he's like, yeah, it's highly infectious. And if somebody had it on the plane, most likely with recirculated air, you're going to get it. And he said the same thing with the people playing basketball. If somebody put it on a ball and touched their face, and you're sharing that ball and they had the COVID, you're going to get it, right? Most likely. So I think the world that they were trying to transform, all these different issues we're seeing exacerbated and illustrated in our own time. And the other piece is this idea of partisanship and leadership, where Malcolm and Martin, when you understand them as revolutionary sides of the same coin, you don't have to pick a side of saying your team Martin and your team Malcolm, if you really see the goals that they were trying to struggle towards.
When you say that they're revolutionary sides of the same coin, I like that phrasing. Why are they so often remembered or misremembered then as polar opposites?
Well, I mean, some of that is real in the sense of, were there divergences and differences? Yes. I mean, Malcolm is calling Dr. King an Uncle Tom, a fool, a sellout during his early years. Some of that's to get attention. Some of that is because this is how he really feels. They're looking at Black struggle and Black dignity and citizenship and humanity in different ways. One of the things that I argue is that when we think about Malcolm X, he's talking about radical Black dignity. He's coming out of the Garvey tradition. And what he means by radical Black dignity is radical Black political self-determination that doesn't need approval by white authority figures or white legitimation. Malcolm is an advocate until 64, 65 of racial separatism, which is not racial segregation. Racial separatism is Black people saying they have the choice to build parallel institutions because white supremacy disallows racial integration. As early as 1960, and I show this in the book, when Malcolm's debating people like Bayard Rustin and James Farmer, he's saying he's fine with racial integration if you didn't have to fight and get military to bring Black kids to school and get guards to prevent white racial violence and racial terror against Black bodies. So he makes convincing points. He's talking to Dr. Kenneth Clark in 1963, and he's saying that there should be no civil rights movement in a country that has the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. He's saying if you're struggling for that, it means you're not a citizen. And that's why Malcolm famously says that American democracy is something that Black people have never had, don't have, and never will have. right? This idea of American democracy as hypocrisy. King, on the other hand, is talking about radical Black citizenship. And what King argues is that that radical Black citizenship is not just the absence of racial oppression, it's actually certain guarantees that African Americans should have. And those guarantees are not just voting rights and civil rights, it's a guaranteed income and living wage, it's healthcare, it's the end of racial segregation in public schools, and it's a decent housing as well. So when we think about them, the reason why we think about them as polar opposites, on one level, they did come out as adversaries, but over time, as the context of the 1960s unfolds before them, they start converging. King becomes a much more militant and radical figure. And Malcolm starts to see that, one, the civil rights movement is not just a top-down movement, it's a bottom-up movement, especially after Ronald Stokes, a member of the Nation of Islam, is murdered by the LAPD in Los Angeles in 1962. But also when Malcolm goes to Birmingham in 63, when Malcolm goes to Washington, D.C. in 1963, while the Birmingham crisis is unfolding, he starts to gain more respect for King, even as he's upset about the sight of racial violence against peaceful demonstrators in Birmingham. So by the time Malcolm talks about ballot or the bullet, he's finally coming to terms with the fact that Black people are going to need to use democratic institutions like voting rights to try to transform this country. And by the time King is really talking about, even before the Vietnam War, Watts becomes a real turning point for King, because he understands that voting rights, civil rights haven't been enough to get the kind of granular freedom and granular liberation for Black people at the local level.
I want to get to some of those points of convergence, but the book is awesome. By the way, I told you that, and I'm going to keep telling you that. I don't want to give too much away, but you do talk in there about Malcolm sort of representing Black America's prosecuting attorney, and Martin representing America's defense attorney. I wonder if you could tell me what you mean by that.
Yeah, when I think about Malcolm X, and when we talk about convergence, I want to talk about both of them with slavery, but Malcolm is really the boldest critic of white supremacy of the 20th century. And what I mean by that is not white people like people think, but white supremacy as an institution. Sometimes now we've talked about white privilege, we talk about white fragility with Robin DiAngelo. When we think about white supremacy is a social, historical, political, cultural context, right? And it's something that legitimates different bodies and different political institutions at the micro and macro level. So when I say Malcolm X was this critic of white supremacy, I mean it in a very, very broad way. What Malcolm does is he criticizes the way in which racial slavery has shaped American democracy and distorted and disfigured American democracy and set up an institution of Jim Crow, racial terror, but also political and economic and cultural inequality between whites and Blacks in the United States and also globally. And in so doing, Malcolm prosecutes white supremacists and white supremacy for what he calls crimes against Black humanity. So Malcolm's not interested in a kind of rapprochement that has a fake moral equivalency between slave masters and those who are enslaved. So Malcolm is very, very clear on that. And really King becomes much clearer on that the last several years, but initially there's a divergence there. So Malcolm is prosecuting. He's prosecuting not just white district attorneys in the criminal justice system. Malcolm understood what mass incarceration was way before most of us, because he was in prison, and so did the Nation of Islam. So way before Black Lives Matter was marching and white people and Black people got woke, Malcolm was calling us Black when we were proud to be Negro, right? We were all Negroes before Malcolm, Marcus Garvey, right? And Gil Scott-Heron has a famous poem. We're saying we were Negroes before Malcolm, and you were riding through Harlem in your Cadillac with your white girl while the grass prepared, right? And so when we think about Malcolm, that's what he's prosecuting, but he's also telling Black people that their liberation is going to be found in the last place they suspected, which is within the bowels and the bosom of the Black community and Black history and culture and Africa, right? That's what he's saying. And so when we think about King, King is a defense attorney. King is defending blacks to whites and whites to blacks. He's telling whites that black people aren't going to be vengeful, that yes, they're human beings. He's trying to change minds and hearts. He's also telling black people that white people aren't just racial terrorists. White people aren't just genetically predisposed to commit crimes against black people like the Nation of Islam is articulating. So King is a defense attorney, and he's talking about a beloved community that's going to require shared sacrifice. Most people ignore the shared sacrifice part of King's message, or just think that he means black folk sacrificing. At times, Malcolm makes that error, but it's a categorical error. It's a mistake, because King is talking about shared sacrifice by whites and blacks, even as early as the March on Washington, August 28, 1963. When King says, now is the time to make real the promise of democracy, he doesn't mean business as usual. He means that we're all going to have to suffer and share, have shared sacrifice. And in that speech, he even says, we're going to have to struggle together and we're going to have to go to jail together, because King realizes that American democracy is unjust. The good person and good communities only have to go to jail as part of social protest movements in an unjust society. So when we think about the fact that in 1963, there's a 10-week period where there's about 800 civil rights demonstrations in the United States in May and June, 15,000 people are arrested for civil rights demonstrations, for trying to gain more justice. You're only arrested for that in an unjust society. And Dr. King realizes what kind of society we have.
You talk about the revolutionary King, and you say that sort of in the later years of his life, he actually takes on some of that prosecuting attorney role. I'm wondering, does Malcolm ever become a defense attorney?
Yeah, I think Malcolm does. I think when we think about, and one of the metaphors that I use, the main one is the sword and the shield. And we usually think of Malcolm as the sword, Dr. King as the shield. And what I argue in this book is that they both at various times in their career really served as both. So Malcolm becomes a shield to this idea of global humanity. Certainly by the time he goes to Mecca in May of 1964, and he's talking about the civil rights movement as a human rights movement, he becomes an Orthodox Muslim. He wants to be this internationally recognized faith leader, as well as a political leader. And so, when he comes back from the first trip to Africa in 1964, he had spent 5 weeks there in 1959 as well in the Middle East. He's asked on May 21st, what's his views on whites and can they be part of organizations and movements? And he says that, white people can be part of social and political transformation if they give up white supremacy, right? And one of the things that he argues is that even if white people treat him with respect, which they did as Malcolm X, not necessarily as Malcolm Little, unless that respect and that dignity was given to every single black person who was alive, it didn't matter and didn't count. So he does start talking about human rights. Malcolm famously is trying to go to the United Nations, a la the Paul Robeson and the radicals in the 1940s, who had the We Charge genocide pamphlet, trying to say the United Nations should really censor the United States for human rights violations. Malcolm is going to different African nations. He spends 24 weeks in Africa and the Middle East in 1964. Malcolm famously has an office at the United Nations, and he introduces the young Cassius Clay on his way to becoming Muhammad Ali to all these different diplomats who Muhammad Ali is going to utilize, subsequently in his career. So when we think about them, they're both much more complicated. And as the book shows, when you look at them side by side, what they're doing, they're both influencing, thinking about each other, impacting each other much, much more than we give credit for. And part of that thing, Todd, why do we look at them as sword and shield, is that we've rewritten the narrative of the civil rights movement in a way that uplifts and upholds American exceptionalism. So we've rewritten it in a way that Dr. King and his fight against white supremacy and his fight against militarism, materialism, racism, we excise that from the narrative We stopped King either in Selma in 1965 or at the March on Washington in 63. And we say, this is an example of American exceptionalism. Just like we use Barack Obama as that same example. And Obama was willing to be used in that way, but King was not. King is not an example of inexorable racial progress. King is an example of this revolutionary social movement leader who's willing to use nonviolent civil disobedience to bring Western civilization to its knees, a la Stokely Carmichael, but by different means. That's the whole thing. So what people have to understand is, if King was so good and it was so nonviolent, he would not have been assassinated. I want everybody to understand that. And if it's so Christian and if it's so welcoming, he would not have been assassinated at 39. He'd have been taken a cabinet position, just like Thurgood Marshall became Solicitor General and then Supreme Court Justice. No, King is saying that we're not going to bring a gun or a knife or a curse word to Washington, D.C. But way before Occupy Wall Street, Dr. King said we're going to occupy Washington, D.C. with Black folks from Marks, Mississippi, with Native Americans, with Mexican Americans, with poor whites from Appalachia. And King even said it, we're not leaving. Dr. King said it. He said, well, where are you going to leave? Aren't you going to? We're going to stay there. And King was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee, helping 1,100 Black garbage workers, sanitation workers, who were on strike for a living wage. Way before Bernie Sanders, we had Martin Luther King Jr. talking about a living wage, redistributive, not just wealth, but redistributive justice. Because just like Brian Stevenson says, the opposite of poverty is not wealth, it is justice. It is justice. And that's what Dr. King is trying to get.
Well, you talked about, looking at them side by side. So literally, I want to take us to that moment, to the meeting. For those who might be unfamiliar with the meeting, perhaps explain to us the context in which Malcolm and Martin met one another, and what did that interaction look like?
Yeah, they meet one time, March 26, 1964, at the U.S. Senate. And the Senate is filibustering the 1964 Civil Rights Act, which is going to be passed on July 2nd of that year. And Malcolm has left the Nation of Islam. He has been forcefully kicked out of the Nation of Islam. The excuse is that Malcolm said chickens come home to roost following the November 22nd, 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy in Dallas, Texas. But that is an excuse. All Malcolm meant by that phrase was that the violence that the United States was perpetrating upon the world had reverberated back to its commander-in-chief. And remember, 4 years later, Martin Luther King Jr. is going to say America is the greatest purveyor of violence on the planet Earth, in the world, right? Malcolm is thrown out of the Nation of Islam because he is politicizing the Nation of Islam. He's turning the Nation of Islam from a religious group to a political group. They are fearing their tax-exempt status being withdrawn. They are fearing Malcolm getting them into civil rights demonstrations. Malcolm has been supposedly on the sidelines of those demonstrations, but he's at demonstrations in Washington, D.C., in Harlem, and elsewhere, and leading different movements. So when we think about March 26, 1964, Malcolm has started Muslim Mosque Incorporated. He's trying to build a secular movement, but he's also trying to gain disgruntled soldiers and members of the Nation of Islam to be part of this movement. And he goes to listen to the Senate filibuster really as a statesman, as somebody who's a political leader who wants to radicalize the civil rights movement. He wants an alliance with the civil rights movement, including King, but he wants it on his own terms. Whereas King is coming from a different perspective. At that point, King is coming from meetings at the White House with Lyndon Johnson, the new president. King had become closer to John F. Kennedy, but Lyndon Johnson becomes a real political partner with King. King is on close speaking terms with people like Vice President Hubert Humphrey. So he comes to Washington, D.C. as, Time Magazine Man of the Year. It's 7 months before his Nobel Prize is announced. He comes as this undisputable, not just faith leader, but this secular political statesman whose power, when it comes to civil rights and human rights and issues of racial justice, really rivals that of the president. So he's an unelected statesman. And so they come and they're both doing press conferences. Malcolm is saying that, even if there's a Civil Rights Act, which he supports, he doesn't think it's going to be enforced. And so in a lot of ways, Malcolm's skepticism is always important for us, because when we think about civil rights or we think about voting rights and Shelby v. Holder, Malcolm was right about enforcement. Malcolm was saying that we have to be vigilant, because even if these things are passed, Malcolm had grown up in Lansing, Michigan. Malcolm had lived in Mason, Michigan. Malcolm had lived in Roxbury in Boston. He lived in Harlem. He lived all over, so he understood at the granular level. He'd been in prison for 7 years. He understood how white supremacy really works at the granular level. And he said, even if these laws are passed, we're going to have to be vigilant. King, on the other hand, is coming in there and trying to get as strong of a legislation as he can. I mean, King is also a political lobbyist, just like Malcolm is. So they're coming side by side in a very interesting way. And King is going to have a press conference, and he's going to go into a room where Malcolm is sitting right on the couch at the U.S. Senate building. Malcolm listens to his entire press conference, and when they're leaving, Malcolm is with Benjamin Kareem, one of his assistants, and he makes sure that they bump into each other, and they have that very famous handshake. The photos from the Associated Press and United Press International, one smiling, the other they're frowning, and they say good to see each other, and they say they're going to have plans to meet each other. And really, Malcolm follows through. Malcolm sees King December 17th, 1964 in Harlem. He sits down for a whole speech after King wins the Nobel Peace Prize at the 369th Armory. There's over 8,000 people there. Malcolm is sitting next to Andy Young, Ambassador Andrew Young, former mayor of Atlanta, Andrew Young, who's one of King's really key lieutenants and part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and Reverend Andy Young in his own right. And Malcolm speaks about King's speech a few days later. Malcolm visits King, tries to see King in Selma, February 3rd, 4th, 1965. King is in prison during the Selma movement. Malcolm speaks at Brown AME Chapel. He speaks to Coretta Scott King as well, and tells Coretta that he believes in what Dr. King is doing, and he's not trying to hurt the movement. He's trying to help the movement. Coretta says she found him very, very sincere. Malcolm tells reporters afterwards that everybody here should support what Dr. King is doing, because what he wants is the ballot. And if the ballot is not gotten, Black people are going to get their liberation one way or the other. So he's giving people either or choice, trying to work with King in that way. He's disallowed from seeing King, but Clarence Jones, who's Dr. King's attorney, had met with Malcolm, and they were trying to make plans to actually meet and talk about grounds of convergence. And obviously Malcolm's going to be assassinated February 21st, 1965. So that second meeting, or really that third meeting, never takes place.
To what extent, if any, do you think Malcolm, I don't know if the word is orchestrated or facilitated, some say, he was outgrowing the nation, but did he willfully ignore an edict from Elijah Muhammad in order to bring about his break with the nation? Or
I think subconsciously, yes. I think he had been ignoring Elijah Muhammad for a long time. And I think that the way in which that relationship worked, people talk about it being a father-son relationship. I think it did work in that way. But at the same time, I think that Elijah Muhammad knew what he had in Malcolm and the devotion Malcolm had, and he utilized that to cultivate the organization and to feather his nest for as long as that was as long as that was possible. So when Malcolm comes out of prison, there's only several hundred members of the Nation of Islam, no more than 400 or 500 nationally. By the time he exits the group, there's going to be over 50,000 members. So that's going to be Malcolm X's organizing, his charisma, but he also helped set up a cult of personality around Elijah Muhammad and the fruit of Islam and martial techniques that really come back to hurt him and help partially lead to his own assassination. He sees once he leaves that group that you can't have a cult of personality around anyone. And he's not interested in, and the reason why we think about Malcolm in 64, and sometimes people who are socialists claim him, Black nationalists claim him, Pan-Africanists claim him, sometimes liberal integrationists claim him, sometimes conservatives claim him, is that it's not that he felt every single one of those points, but he is constantly saying he's flexible. And the reason why he's saying he's flexible is that he says, look, I had been trapped in my mind in one kind of prison with a devotion to the Honorable Elijah Muhammad, and he didn't ever want to go through that again.
Well, this idea of convergence has come up a couple of times now. You've mentioned a few names, persons, relationships, perhaps that King and Malcolm X shared in common, Andy Young, Stokely Carmichael, Clarence Jones. But as you acknowledge in the text, perhaps no one spent as much time with Malcolm and Martin as James Baldwin. Still, there's a quotation from Baldwin that you referenced that might jump off the page to some readers. Baldwin says this: by the time each met his death, there was practically no difference between them. What's your reaction to that conclusion by Baldwin?
Well, I think there were still some differences, but I understand what he means by that. Certainly, Malcolm always retains the idea of self-defense and the idea that this revolution may have to be violent. And he's thinking about what's happening globally in Africa, what's happening in Latin America, what's happening in the Caribbean. He also doubts the ability of, when we think about white supremacy and racial capitalism, and all we mean by racial capitalism is this idea that when we think about US capitalism and Western capitalism, historically and contemporaneously, it's predicated on the exploitation, the dehumanization of Black bodies. That's what we're saying. We're saying there's never been a capitalist system without racial slavery, without Jim Crow segregation, without mass incarceration, without the exploitation of Black bodies. That's how everyone reaps benefits from this particular system. And so Malcolm doubts that you're going to be able to transform that system without bloodshed. But in terms of human rights, in terms of being vocally critical of white supremacy, in terms of being against the war, Malcolm's a critic of the Vietnam War. There's real convergences. One thing I write in the book is in '64, Malcolm is interviewed by Robert Penn Warren for a book, Who Speaks for the Negro? And King is interviewed separately. And Malcolm tells Robert Penn Warren that he shares Dr. King's goals. Dr. King wants Black dignity and freedom, and he shares them. He says, our methods might be different, but we share the same goals. So when we think about by '67, Dr. King talking about Black is beautiful and it's so beautiful to be Black. Dr. King is talking about Black political self-determination. King criticizes Black power, but never repudiates Black power. He locks and marches arm in arm with Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, the firebrand political revolutionary, Pan-Africanist, SNCC chairman, and Black power popularizer and organizer. So King, when you look at King, and I have the last two chapters of the Radical King and the Revolutionary King, where the first 9 chapters really look at both King and Malcolm, you see King's real evolution and how he starts to really sound like Malcolm X. He's saying that the halls of racism are running wild. The halls of Congress are running wild with racism. He says that to the American Psychological Association in '67, the problem in the United States is not Black people, it's white people and white supremacy. He's saying this. He's saying, and that you social scientists need to investigate that. And he said all these white people are deploying racial oppression, and they say, and chaos, and then they say things would be better if the Negro wasn't chaotic, if Black people weren't chaotic. So all you have to do is see the speeches, whether it's the drum major instinct, whether it's the Riverside speech, and you see not only is he talking about these triple threats, but he's saying we're going to obliterate this oppression, and here's the society we're going to create, this new society. So the beloved community is not just this sappy, multiracial, multicultural Benetton ad. He understands that there's going to be blood spilled because of state-sanctioned violence, that there's an immoral, unethical, illegal regime that everyone's under. And all he's saying, and this is where you are taking Gandhian nonviolence, but also Jesus and the New Testament, and also Old Testament prophets, and saying, what if you bring a mass of people here to do what? And this is what we say when all of us who've read the Bible bear witness. That's what when you're reading the Bible, because we're saying we're going to bear witness to what? This injustice. We're not saying we're going to take arms. We're saying we're going to bear witness. But guess what you do when you bear witness? A lot of times what regimes and rulers and dictators do, they slaughter people for bearing witness. For bearing witness. No, you didn't do anything. You're not even trying to climb over that man's fence or that woman's fence, but you're outside of the fence. And they deploy what? Violence, because it's an unjust society. And that's what King said. So when we think about King, by the end, King is saying we are going to bear witness to these injustices. But here's where it converges with Malcolm. Malcolm had said the March on Washington in '63 was the farce on Washington because the original plan was to shut DC down with nonviolent civil disobedience in the way that Black Lives Matter activists have done in Washington, DC and Oakland, Miami, shut highways. I was there in Boston in 2015 when they did it. And people say, I can't get to work. I can't believe they shut the highways down. And Malcolm said, I approve of that. By 67, 68, King is talking about exactly that. We're going to paralyze cities nonviolently. He starts writing about it in 65, right? And so in that sense, you see the revolutionary convergence. And again, I have to let, everyone should know there's a reason why both of these men are assassinated at the age of 39. It's not because of guns or violence by them. It's because of what they represent in terms of for systemic structural change and being able to build movements and coalitions that could bear witness. Doesn't mean those movements were necessarily going to win, but when you bring hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people to bear witness, change does come and or violence comes, right? And that's Birmingham, the Children's Crusade. That's the sit-in movement. People were coming in to bear witness. This is not right. This is immoral, unethical. And guess what the immoral, unethical people did? They showed the world how immoral and unethical they were, right? That's why in 63 with Birmingham, the headlines in 63 in France are sauvage. That means savage in French. And they're talking about the white people as savages, not the Black folks. The white people as savages because of what? Because of Kelly Ingram Park and fire hoses that can tear the bark off of trees, and 1,100 third and fourth and fifth graders in jail. Of course, that's a sick society, like Dr. King said. And of course, these are horrific people who would be willing to do this to children. But when we see what they did to children in that time, we can't be so alarmed in the context of the coronavirus and say we're surprised about what's happening to Black people and poor people now, which is why King was going for broke and saying we're going to occupy Washington, D.C. and we're going to stay there. And King had enough global integrity and global leverage that if he had been in Washington, D.C. in the summer of '68, the Congress would have had to have done something. Instead, he's assassinated in Memphis. They never let him get to Washington, D.C. And right before he's coming to D.C., they're saying King is going to bring chaos and violence to D.C. The national press, after the Vietnam speech, starts treating King like he was Malcolm X. And white people start saying, oh, he's a high point, Time Magazine Man of the Year, Nobel Prize. White people start to say, King is dangerous and he's a bad guy.
Yeah, no, so often when I'm talking with people, I talk to them about some of the opinion polls that were out of King at the time, saying that exact same thing. As I think about both Malcolm and Martin and looking at the present moment, what would you say is the debt that contemporary racial justice struggles owe to Malcolm and to Martin?
Yeah, I think they owe tremendous debt. I think that contemporary struggles have built and amplified the work, especially in terms of intersectionality. They were racial and economic justice advocates. They were advocates of human rights, of Black dignity and citizenship. But contemporary movements have talked about the gender, sexuality, everything from mental health to the politics of geography, identity in the most expansive ways. But when we talk about everything from mass incarceration to anti-poverty to Medicare for all, to a world free of endless war, to American foreign policy that respects Africa, that respects the third world, that respects immigrants and immigration. You think about Malcolm's mother, Louise Norton Little, is from Grenada. We're talking about Malcolm and Martin. And we're also talking about resisting state-sanctioned violence, whether that is the US military or police or just racial vigilantes. That's Malcolm and Martin. And when we're really talking about rights, expanding notions of citizenship, freedom, democracy, what this nation means, we're really talking about Malcolm and Martin, and really both the nonviolent civil disobedience, but also the revolutionary structural critique that Malcolm has, and then King has of America's foreign and domestic policy, and this idea of American imperialism, empire, and racial capitalism is really coming from them. So we really do need a generation to sort of understand their importance in terms of contemporary politics, and also the policy interventions they do are major.
Hey Todd, hate to interrupt. We'll have about 5 minutes left on the interview, then we'll go to audience Q&A. Viewers out there, if you have a question, now is the time to hit the Ask a Question button down below our faces. Type out your question, and you can upvote people's questions. So we'll have about 5 minutes till audience Q&A.
Sure, thank you very much. I'm not sure if you're one of those scholars who dislikes playing the what if game, but I'm going to ask a what if kind of question. If their lives had not been cut short, were they on a trajectory to resolve some of their differences? And maybe where do you think those differences stand today?
Well, that's very interesting. I think that Malcolm would have definitely been trying to build a global and domestic movement, and King as well. I think that Malcolm was interested in self-determination, but originally with Black people and African descended peoples all over the world. That expanded into the third world once he sort of realizes the expansiveness of Islam in the third world, and sort of a global radical Islam in the best sense, as sort of a peace movement, a movement for human rights. I do think that there was convergence, and there would have been convergence. I think it would have been hard to organize, though, because I think that one of the things that never happens is a meeting between these two where they can really hash out differences and see where there are areas of alignment. I think if Malcolm had lived into the late 60s, King had become such a pariah for the white establishment, he would have been open to that meeting. Malcolm, by 67, once Malcolm comes out, once King comes out against that war, really you can see his alliance with Stokely Carmichael, who in a way becomes a stand-in for Malcolm X. You know, when we think about Stokely in 1966, 67, and 68, and one of the reasons why Stokely leaves for Africa is because as a stand-in and as somebody who's being looked upon as a rival to Malcolm X, he would have been assassinated too if he hadn't left and gone to Africa, right? That's why Kwame Ture, life cut short, prostate cancer, in 1998, but he wouldn't have survived if he had just stayed here in the United States. So I do think there were convergences, and I think those convergences remain around really all the things that we're talking about in the context of COVID and Corona. What are rights? What are citizens guaranteed? What is a beloved community? What is a good society? Not even just a great society, but a good society. What does redistributive justice and wealth look like? Medicare for all look like? What is a world that doesn't brutalize Black people and make money off of their brutalization? Whether we're talking about Ferguson, whether we're talking about all the Department of Justice consent decrees, whether we're talking about all the sort of mass immiseration that we see Black people subjected to, what does that world look like? And then if we take that misery away, what do rights look like? What is the society obligated to provide for people in terms of education, in terms of housing, in terms of healthcare, in terms of a neighborhood that's safe and free of both police violence, but environmental toxicity, clean air, clean water, when we think about Flint, Michigan. So there's a lot there that I think they would have converged on. It becomes interesting to see what the vehicle to get there would have been, because their mission would have been how to implement some of these changes, make them more far-reaching at the granular scale.
Thank you. I was trying to see if Alex was jumping back in there. If not, I'll come up with another question.
Here we are. All right, so we got our audience to not let us down. We've got some great questions here. I'll start with this one from Sarah Jean Elliott. She wants to know about the human fallibilities of Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr., the term she uses is quote unquote womanizing. So could you address those issues?
Yeah, I mean, these are both men who have their own flaws and shortcomings. I'll start with Malcolm. Malcolm, as a young man, is traumatized by the death of his father. His father is killed allegedly by the Black Legion in Lansing, Michigan, in 1931, when he's 6 years old. And Malcolm really spends, his mother, Louise Norton Little, is going to be institutionalized for really, close to 30 years. In a mental institution. Malcolm really is lost for many, many years, and he goes to live with his half sister Ella Mae Collins in 1940, and really for the next 6 years he's in and out of in and out of trouble. He becomes really a hustler, maybe not as big of a hustler as he claims in the autobiography when you read Malcolm Manning Marable's biography. But certainly he's involved in criminal activities. He's going to be a womanizer while he's involved in these criminal activities. And he's going to go to jail for 7 years. And really, after his stint in jail and during his stint in jail, he becomes this really morally and ethically transformed individual who never has any kind of extramarital relations with anyone. So King is coming from a different tradition. King is coming from a Black, upper middle class, church, patriarchal tradition where many of the preachers think that it's their right to engage in extramarital affairs. And so King, we know this, especially posthumously, was a womanizer, was somebody who had these extracurricular activities. I think that with King and Malcolm, these flaws don't negate their politics and their political integrity. I think they show them just to be human and fallible. I think since the assassination of John F. Kennedy, we've learned much more about his womanizing as well, including in the White House, right? And so I think that when I think about their flaws, it just shows you that these are complicated people, including the allegations, King plagiarized parts of his doctoral dissertation at BU, and some of this stuff has come out like 30 years ago. And I think initially the King estate and people were very, very frightened for his legacy, but I don't think it diminishes his legacy. If anything, it just shows you that people can be extraordinary historical figures, but just as human and as complex and as fallible as anyone else.
This next question is from Abby. She says, what advice would you give to young students studying African American history and history in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think my advice is really to try to learn the story, and the story is the story of us. There's that NBC show called This Is Us, and my version, is This Is Us, where try to find out the story. I would start with the civil rights movement to the present, because I think that's in a lot of ways a story that younger people can relate to. And then once they have that grounding and because that's how I got it. Like once you got and you have your anchors, you could go and wrestle with racial slavery. I think it's better to do the contemporary and the historic, but relative post World War II to the present for young people. And I think they should absolutely know about racial slavery, but I think it's hard to tell them about racial slavery. It's hard to teach a young person about racial slavery, and for them, Black person especially, and come away whole. It's in some ways knowing the contemporary story where people had social movements and social activism. Not to say none of that took place during racial slavery, because it did, but just that it's hard to wrap your head around, because it took me a while to wrap my head around racial slavery. And when you're Haitian, you can say, well, we got liberation in 1804. And you can fall back on Toussaint Louverture and Dessalines and Boukman and all that, but it's hard. So I'd say know the story of the civil rights movement, know the story, obviously, of 1619 to the present, when you think about the New York Times Project, and Black people, how they've helped to shape the United States, American democracy, and the world. but know why we're in the condition that we are in now.
This next question is from Sharon. She writes, did the FBI actively try to pit Reverend King and Malcolm X against each other to undermine their movements and fracture the quest for civil rights?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes, they absolutely did. And it's not just the FBI, it's Bureau of Special Services, Mississippi Sovereign Committee, it's FBI informants, FBI agents that are planted in both SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and certainly the Nation of Islam was rife with FBI, both informants and just actual agents. One of the things that the FBI innovates is hiring Black people when they had never hired any Black agents to spy on the movement. So yes, they are absolutely and dramatic destabilizing force. The State Department as well, the CIA as well. This is definitely very global. Some of this stuff is declassified. That's why I can say this. I've seen State Department stuff on Malcolm X. I've seen State Department stuff on King and Stokely Carmichael. So we have the documentation. We don't have all of it. Some of it has been gone missing. Some of it is still classified. We just have more access to thousands of pages through, or tens of thousands through the Freedom of Information Act, FOIA.
This next question is from Scott. He says, are there ways you could suggest we could use or apply the term radical more broadly to encompass both Malcolm X and MLK? Malcolm X seems to usually get described as radical and MLK as less so. Could they both fit into that term?
Oh, yes. And that's the point of the book. I think they're both radicals and revolutionaries. And I think radical just means to go to the root of a problem. And so I think that they're both trying to get to the root of this quest for Black citizenship and dignity. And the revolutionary is this idea of really transforming the relationship between citizens and society, you know, and when we think about that, and that society is like, it can be government, it can be rules and regulations, laws, institutions, and they're both revolutionaries in that way because they realize that to try to transform American society requires revolutionary change. Now, their methods over time are going to converge. Initially, Malcolm is talking about self-defense and talking about even a Black nationalist army. I think King always realizes that's not going to work because the numbers aren't there and the appetite for that is not there. I think Malcolm comes to that realization and becomes much more of a diplomat prime minister through both exiting the Nation of Islam, traveling abroad. And he also, it's interesting that the question used the term broadly. Malcolm says that travel broadens one. When people ask him, hey, have you changed? What happens? And he says that travel broadens your vision and your scope. And so he becomes a revolutionary who's interested in using different methods as well.
We have time for just a couple more questions here. This question is from Keith Long. Keith writes, was Malcolm following events in South Africa? Did he ever have any contact with members of the ANC?
You know, he's following events in South Africa. There are members of the ANC that do write to Malcolm X. Yeah, and we have that, the Malcolm X papers at the Schaumburg. So he's aware of Nelson Mandela. He writes about Mandela. He talks about Mandela in radio interviews, and he's excited that people forget that Mandela was down with doing guerrilla warfare at one point and goes to prison and comes out different. Starts out sort of nonviolently, moves over to the left, and then comes back through you know, the many years in prison on Robbins Island. So yes, he was. Yeah, he was. And King is aware too. King is connected with South Africa and these liberation movements as well.
This next question is from my good friend Todd Neely. Todd says, so much has been written on MLK and Malcolm X. How did you go about finding new material to use for this book? And how did you place Stokely Carmichael into the story of King and Malcolm X?
Yeah, I think the new material is one, there's more published papers for, you know, the Clayborne, Carson, MLK papers besides going to the King archives. I think when people, like when Dr. Cohn did his Malcolm Martin book, the Malcolm X papers weren't available at the Schaumburg. So there definitely are new archival sources. There's uncovered speeches that you can listen to in their entirety, different, everything from Pacifica radio archives to the King archives. So it's not just a transcribed speech, it's listening to it. So there's definitely different materials. And, you know, surprisingly, I'll say this, there really haven't been a ton of serious comparative books about Malcolm and Martin. That's the interesting part. The interesting part is that, you know, you really have James Cohn's book, a classic book. And after that, you don't have major books, which is one of the reasons why I considered doing this. And I was actually surprised at that. There's not a lot of major books that look at Malcolm and Martin comparatively and make arguments, interpretive arguments about them. And certainly there was Felix Lomax from 1968. Yeah.
So this will be our last question, and then I'll toss it over to you, Todd, for one final question. Sound good? So this question is from Scott. He writes, could you talk a bit about the role and responsibilities and difficulties of being an activist scholar?
Oh, sure. And the final thing I'll say for that last question too, Stokely Carmichael, it's easy enough to write him into King's story because they're really connected. You could actually write a whole book on just Carmichael and King and sort of the relationship they have in 66, 67, 68, but they first meet in 63 at Howard University. They are at the Mississippi Meredith March together, and they are friends, whereas Malcolm and King never became friends. Stokely Carmichael, who's this really radical, revolutionary student activist and organizer, becomes good friends with Dr. King. So Stokely is definitely in there in a big way. And they love each other. They actually love each other. Stokely is in tears when King is assassinated and very, very upset. You know, in terms of being a scholar activist, I think I talked at the start about my mom. I think that's just part of what I do. I haven't found it difficult because I never expected to be a professor. So that's part of it too. So I went to Stony Brook University, Stony Brook in the house, and Temple University, Temple's in the house. And so I have a bunch of colleagues and friends, dear people who I love, but a lot of them are coming from families where they expected this, you know what I mean? Like they expected to write books. You know, these are Ivy League and they went to private academies and different stuff. So apparently we train these folks in this society. And for those people like me, you just found yourself here. I would have thought I'd be an organizer or something. And even the early schools that I taught at, Arizona State, University of Rhode Island, I wasn't expecting any more. I wouldn't have expected to be at University of Texas or to run a center or to do these things. I was really interested in social change and interested in these stories of Black radicals and connecting to these stories, what's actually happening in the real world in a contemporaneous way. What's happening, everybody's just present day-to-day problem. So I have found it that it works for me. I think I'm always following my passion. I was interested in Black power before it was like a commodity within the academy. Now it's become a commodity. But when I started writing about Black power, 20 something years ago, many people told me not to do that and don't do that. It wasn't a lane that you were getting book contracts and different stuff for. So I'd say the way to navigate it is to think about your work, what makes you passionate, make that convergent with your teaching and your administrative duties, and be willing to speak truth to power, whether you're an assistant professor or what have you, because you have to be comfortable and be you. Like I didn't start speaking up once I got tenure. I was speaking up way before that, and you're just comfortable and authentic in your own skin. And some people won't like it. You know, there are some institutions that you're not going to have a chance to speak at or teach at or whatever. But if you're thank you, Alan. If you're true to yourself and you lean in, like these folks did, you know, like one of the things I talk about, the big convergence between Malcolm and Martin is political integrity, personal sincerity, and really an unapologetic love for Black people, which is big. King loved Black people, Mississippi Delta, Alabama Black Belt, and Malcolm loved Black people who had been in jail and who were addicted to drugs. I mean, you can't get deeper than that. And so they love Black people who other Black people didn't love. We can make a claim we love them, but it's not true. Most Black people who aren't in that class, they don't feel comfortable going to a prison. You know, if you've never been in jail before, I've had the opportunity to teach in jail and do those things. But if you've not been raised in the hood, I was raised in all black Southside Jamaica, Queens. You're not going to be comfortable coming up in there if you were raised in the suburbs. And that doesn't make you a bad person. But these were folks who really connected with the black quotidian, or what Sly Stone talks about, everyday people, right? That's who they connected with, right? And so that's what makes them so extraordinary. So I'd say as a scholar activist, you have to walk the talk and really love the people who you're talking about. We've all met people on the left or progressives where you see them in their private life and, you know, they're not nice people. And you're like, what? You know what I mean? Like, I've read this person, seen this person on stage, and this person's not a kind person. You've got to walk the talk. And I think when you read about Malcolm and Martin, you see that they did walk the talk. Whatever their shortcomings and infallibility are, they loved people. They were kind to people. Doesn't mean they didn't make mistakes, but there was no pretense about them and the connection to ordinary people. And the last thing is that they both die poor, which doesn't help their families. In 65 and 68, their families have to struggle and hustle a lot. Malcolm leaves 6 children behind, 4, and then Betty, his widow, has twins after he passes, 6 girls. King leaves 4 children behind. So they left 2 widows and 10 children behind, but they never took a dime of money that they raised for themselves. Never, not one dime. So these 2 were incorruptible, which is one of the reasons why the FBI is always looking for other things on them, because there are no Swiss bank accounts. There are no secret stashes of money, even though both of them raise millions of dollars, and certainly posthumously, they continue to raise tens of millions of dollars, especially with King, the copyright. We've all seen it, right? Where King papers have been bought, Morehouse and different stuff, 30 million. They've been bought by other stuff for tens of millions, movie rights, the whole deal. So they didn't know they were innovating a kind of brand that was going to turn them into these global figures.
Back over to you, Todd.
Well, Peniel, following you on social media, again, it's hard to believe that this book has only been out for a week because you are everywhere. And so I know this is all obviously what's next for you, being everywhere with this book.
Yeah.
But what are you working on now?
I'm working on a book, Todd, on 1963 and the movement in 1963. I think 63 is a year that we all sleep on. In a lot of ways, I think 63 is as important as 1968 globally. And I think that when you think about 63 is going to be the last year where there's no Civil Rights Act. It's the next to last year where there's no Voting Rights Act. It's really the year that cracks everything open. It's going to be the year where a president gives a civil rights address, first time since Lincoln, since Lincoln's really second inauguration, that a president talks about civil rights in a forceful way, live on television, no less. So it's a big year. It's the year of Birmingham. It's the year James Baldwin's Fire Next Time comes out. It's a major, major year. And I'm really interested in what that means for us as well, because it's also a hopeful year. There's a lot of death, a lot of violence, 16th Street Baptist Church. But you think about the March on Washington, it's a resilient year. It's Malcolm X's last full year in the Nation of Islam. It's King's last year without being also a Nobel Prize recipient. It's an extraordinary year. It's John F. Kennedy's last, almost 11 months as president before the November 22nd assassination. It's Lyndon Johnson's last almost 11 months as vice president and sort of this neutered political figure. So it's this extraordinary period. Gloria Richardson, there's so much going on in 63. So I'm interested in 63 as this revolutionary year, which we haven't really given enough credence to, but what that year means for us almost 60 years later.
Well, Peniel, I can't wait to read what you've got to say about 1963. Thoroughly enjoyed The Sword and the Shield.
Thank you. People
glad that we could have you here in Central PA virtually, but we look forward to having you here physically in the not too distant future. I hope.
Well, thank you so much, Todd, and thank you, Alex, for hosting, and everybody who's been watching this. I know it's a real tough time right now, and I think I still remain optimistic for the future and hope for the future. and sort of the vision for social justice that figures like Dr. King and Malcolm X imbued us all with. Because even as we've seen a lot of negative stories, we've seen a lot of positive stories about people coming together to help each other, about people trying to protest against injustice. And we're also seeing the stories of the disparate impact that this virus is having on African-American and poor people throughout the country. So it's important to keep all those people in our minds and hearts, but also to keep the faith that what Dr. King and Malcolm and the movement was fighting for is not only relevant in our time, but can actually be fulfilled in our time as well.
Peniel, Todd, thank you guys so much for joining us here virtually in Harrisburg. Like Todd said, I can't wait to meet you in person, hopefully in the not too distant future. So thanks again. The book, The Sword and the Shield, there's a button on your Crowdcast link, or visit the bookstore's website, midtownscholar.com. Thanks again, guys, to our viewers out there. Everyone, stay safe. Have a good night.
Take care.